Reassurance, it started last year. Our first team, Roto Zero, went out the door. They're based out of the Baltic and North Sea. And they were doing rebreather diving on historical ordnance, making the seaway safer from stuff that's been down there since the World Wars. It's a big task. It's something we've trained for in all our years, being able to acquire and then get rid of the ordnance that are down on the bottom of the ocean using our rebreathers and handheld sonars and all our EOD equipment. Brings the full picture together as a clearance diver. There's certain things we can do that we train for nonstop that actually be operational. We get to put all that training to good use. Is a huge boost. Yeah, we were working with other countries' clearance divers as well. We had Belgian divers, German divers, Lithuania, all the NATO allies. Every time we would go into port, we'd have a diver meeting and we'd share lessons learned. We worked together seamlessly and came up with better techniques all around. We had 2 XBDs deployed, and on both boats, we had 6-man clearance diver teams and a 3-man REMUS team. The REMUS is the side scan sonar that you program, launch, and it does its own routes. It comes back, you gather the data, and then they go through it all, and then they pinpoint things that they picked up that could be of interest, and then that's when we step in, do our job, reacquire the object, mark it if it is something of interest, and then if it's something that's hazardous, we make it go away. Every time you go underneath water, a human's not designed to be underwater. It's not our natural environment, so there's always that risk as soon as you break the surface. Diving up in the Baltic, it's definitely different. There was times where you made it to 16 meters and you couldn't see anything. Complete pitch black. You're using your handheld sonar, relying on that a lot, and then being very strategic on using your feel once you're close, because these are mines that were meant to go off at some point in their life, so you have to be very careful doing that. The North Sea was heavy current. That was the great thing we worked with NATO allies was the Germans were able to provide us with current chart, and it gave us our windows, and we were able to build off that to be safer diving. That was another positive of working with our NATO allies. There's definitely a lot that is unknown of where these all are. And what happens a lot now is we have what they call drifting mines that were connected with the chain. But over time, the chain breaks off, or the bottom of the mine breaks off, and now you have a mine that's just floating around or laying on the bottom somewhere. So, I mean, you can see the hazard involved with that. That's our task over there, is to make it safer. On a professional level, to do all the training that I've done in the last 8 years and then to put that to operational use, that was a huge takeaway. To have that experience, to know that our training has paid off and that we're safely able to do that job and moving forward, evolve and make this world safer. That was a huge takeaway for me professionally. It's not just Canada that we're a tight community, we're a tight community NATO-wide. All these exercises that we go on, we work with relatively the same teams. We're all the same. It doesn't matter if you have a Canadian flag on your uniform or you're another NATO ally. We all had extensive training, and we all brought that to the forefront and proved it by the Canadian contingent got 6 mines. Other countries got mines as well. The whole package came together. For us to be able to use the equipment that we have right now and to be on the forefront of the task at hand while operational was a great thing to see and to push us forward into the future.